Our next speaker is Seth Villegas, who is a Stanford graduate and pursuing a doctoral degree at Boston University. And he's here to maybe, I hope, put some of these things in context. If we are able to take advantage of genetics, gene therapy, things to extend and prolong our lives, what are the consequences of that, especially for people of faith? He's here to talk about immortality and eschatology. Please welcome Seth Villegas.
Hello everyone, I'm Seth Villegas. I'm currently a doctoral student at Boston University pursuing a degree in religion and science. And what I want to talk to you today is what I'm calling immortality without eschatology. My primary area of research is actually religious-like beliefs among non-religious people, and especially from outsiders who see transhumanists as a kind of quasi-religious phenomenon. That's quite interesting because the perspective of transhumanists themselves is as people who are decidedly non-religious. So there's some interesting questions that come up there. So first, in order to talk about immortality, I think that we should probably talk about the debate around aging. So for instance, how do we actually classify aging as something that happens within the world? And I'm incredibly grateful for Liz Parrish's presentation. This is one of those moments where I wish we could update our presentations in real time, so that way, instead of having to rehash some of this, I could just be talking about mitochondria or something like that. But it's okay, I'll spare you today. And second, the feasibility of age-related treatments. And three, the desirability of life extension. So I'm going to actually be building on a lot of Aubrey work, in part because DeGray presented last year, and I thought he gave a really insightful and very clear explanation of a lot of his own research. So for instance, he talks about aging as basically the inevitable accumulation of self-inflicted damage, and it has this metaphor of the human as a kind of machine, right? So if we think of, say, a car has ongoing problems that are just a result of physics, right? The way that the wheel hits the axle and things like that. And he also wants to deny that something like aging is inevitable. This is actually something that's very important to the larger transhumanist community as a whole. And in fact, if we look at Nick Bostrom's work, for instance, he regards the inevitability of aging, which leads to something further, the conclusion that death itself may not be inevitable. And anything that it kind of accepts that conclusion, he actually calls deathist ideology, which is a pretty striking way to put it. And so instead of thinking about aging as something that just sort of happens, not something we know anything about, to instead look at treating aging as a kind of health problem, right? And as we just saw, there's all these health problems that are directly tied to aging in the way in which our cellular biology works. So if we're talking about the feasibility of age-related treatments, we're just going to want to understand how aging actually works. So there's a much better explanation of that given just a little while ago. But to go over some of it, remember, it's just the ongoing damage that's the result of the cells doing their things. So the division that's going on in the cell, the kind of degradation that happens over time as the body attempts to reproduce itself. And basically, DeGray's theory is basically if we kind of clean up the kind of damage that's ongoing over time, rather than trying to prevent aging itself, like the metabolic processes from the cell doing their thing, we can prevent the thresholds of damage from being reached such that the pathologies that result from aging won't ever happen. And so the use of maintenance is going to be fairly important for DeGray's approach. And finally, empirical testing is going to be the only thing that's going to be getting at which longevity practices are actually worthwhile. It's actually really notable that within transhumanist communities themselves, people are very willing to experiment on themselves in this phenomenon called biohacking. So it's very interesting, though, that trying to live as long as possible and doing that in any way possible is very important to most transhumanists. And finally, there's the desirability of life extension. So I think DeGray is very persuasive on the point that the prevention of aging is really also prevention of suffering, because of all of the kinds of pathologies that result from aging are incredibly debilitating, not only to the person themselves, but also to the family members around them. And finally, just having more years to live and experience life, but also that those years would be healthy years. So they're not just years that you're going on living, but years in which you could really do almost anything you can imagine. So my primary research question in a lot of this is ending aging the same as immortality? And I find this is actually a really important academic question because there's this kind of slippage in the literature in which we're talking about something that's empirical, right? Talking about ending aging as something that we can do to our bodies. And that slips in the talk about immortality itself, which I find to be incredibly strange if we're going to take the kind of atheist materialist assumptions that transhumanists themselves see that they have very seriously. And so I want to present you with this picture. This comes from William Blake's poem called A Reason, or Your Reason. And the reason that I bring it up is Blake had this insight that Enlightenment thinkers weren't trying to get rid of God altogether, but instead they placed something that could accomplish the things that we used to have God do. So here we have your reason is the thing which is promising to accomplish the things that people used to rely on God for. So if we're going to talk about what immortality is, kind of along the same typology as we were talking about aging, I think there's a few things we should consider. I think first of all, it's something beyond radical or even indefinite life extension. It means something well beyond that. And also, we should see that this is the proper end of many transhumanist projects. And it almost doesn't matter how we get there. And what's interesting within the transhumanist literature itself is when they start to talk about things like immortality, they're just throwing things at the wall. They're like, okay, we can fix our metabolic processes, we can upload ourselves into a computer. It doesn't matter how we get there. We just need to make ourselves into the kind of being that no longer ages and no longer dies. And I also want to clarify that I want to say it's also probably a state in which our ongoing survival needs are no longer a priority. So maybe you don't need things like food and water. Maybe you can still eat, but it doesn't really matter if your metabolic processes, I'm not sure. But it necessarily needs being a different kind of person altogether. And this is where we have, in more of the stages that transhumanists think about, we have humans, the transhumans, which are a kind of transition state, hence the trans, and then post-humans, right, which presumably these kinds of beings would be. So if we're talking about the feasibility of immortality, again, taking the kind of naturalistic assumptions that are within transhumanism itself, we would want to think like, well, accidents could probably still happen, right? So how are we getting this kind of talk about there no longer being death simply as a result of changing the way in which our biology works? And finally, there's also this question of like, well, can biological life itself be maintained with everything that we know about cosmology? Say that there's only a finite amount of matter within the universe, that the life of the universe is also finite. And so what's interesting, again, within the transhumanist sort of sphere, there's this sort of eternal focus, and yet everything that we know has this kind of finitude to it. And so I think it's worth looking at how and why that's actually happening. And finally, the desirability of immortality. What's interesting is that not everyone actually agrees that immortality would be a good thing. So for instance, philosopher Bernard Williams talks about how it'd just be boring. Eventually you'd live for so long, you'd have done everything, and you'd just sit around in monotony or something like that. His argument is a lot better than that, of course. But I think one of the important points is that he just talks about like, can you even maintain the sense of self over an indefinite amount of time? Right, especially when you can't really tell what it is that you're doing because your sense of time is no longer sort of there. But also in a lot of literature, say, for instance, a story like Tucker and Massey, there's also a kind of, you either experience a kind of apathy or grief over the fact that the non-immortal life around you, dies while you kind of go on. And so, I grew up in California, and as a Latino, one of the things that I often think about is like, what kind of life are we supposed to be going into? And so I bring up this picture because a lot of transhumanists don't imagine a life of toil, which is something that I believe that the Genesis account actually talks about. And so if our lives are to go on indefinitely, we don't imagine this kind of backbreaking labor, a kind of work that's without end. And if I think about, say, kind of work that my father did, the only reason why he was able to work hundreds, maybe thousands of hours of overtime, or for me to be able to pursue a PhD now, is in part because that work was terminal. It had a determinate end. It wasn't supposed to go on forever. And so if we're thinking about this immortal life as something that's going to be incredibly hard and difficult, of that going on forever, that starts to seem more like hell and not really like heaven. And so within the Christian tradition, Tertullian talks about the immortality of the soul, but what's interesting is that there's this position of theological monism that's kind of emerged lately of trying to say that, well, the body and the mind are probably more like the same thing than they are, qualitatively different. And so I feel it's important to point out because many people aren't always caught up with scholarly debates, and it's interesting to see how that's actually moved and in which transhumanists and theologians actually disagree on the reality of the material body. And so in regards to Christian transhumanists, I guess I just have a few suggestions. The first would be to separate our efforts from aging from the dream of immortality, of something that kind of goes beyond what's empirically possible at the moment. But second, I think we should be thinking about how and why immortality is being desired, especially from a materialist philosophy like transhumanism. And finally, I think we should be thinking about how to contribute to ongoing conversations of what the future should actually be like. Because within the Christian tradition, it's not just about having eternal life for eternal life's sake, but having eternal life with God in a kind of relational future, which is not something that transhumanists usually say. Thank you.